With the right strategies, you can set yourself up for success and paint any white flower that you want. If you've struggled to paint white or light colored flowers, you're not alone. This video is a full length demo of these ivory tulips that I just recently finished painting. They're also featured in the main video for my mini boot camp on painting white flowers, which I'm going to link in the comments down below. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Christine Mercer-Vernon, and I create floral paintings of favorite garden flowers and the insects and pollinators that visit them. I created this channel for my fellow Gen Xers and up who are looking to start or restart their art practice. I also have 2 other white flower painting demos, and I'll link them in the comments as well. We're going to start with a tour of my palette and the colors that I use for all of my floral paintings. Let's jump in with a quick tour of the colors on my palette. If you're interested in a more in-depth breakdown of my colors and how I use them, drop me a comment or question below and I will get to work on it. So I always set up my palette the same way every time. All of my paints are Gamblin with the exception of one. Starting from the left, I have cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, yellow ochre. This one is Michael Harding brand, specifically PY42 is the pigment, cadmium red light, quinacridone magenta, alizarin permanent, ultramarine blue, phthalo turquoise, ivory black, 2 whites, which are titanium white and warm white. And then I also mix up a little pile of a cool purple, which is made from alizarin and phthalo blue. And real quick, you can see here I mixed up a simple palette of 3 to 5 values for each of the colors that I'll be using in this painting. Here's the reference photo that I used. Typically, I work 100% from life during the growing season, which is about 8 to 9 months here. I grow pretty much all of the flowers that I paint, but these tulips came from a friend right down the road who has a flower farm, and I usually get most of my tulips and peonies from her. I didn't have time to paint these when I originally had them because I had other paintings going on, so I took some photos knowing that in the winter I'd need something to paint. I encourage you to work from life as much as possible. When it comes to painting flowers, especially white, ivory, or light colored flowers, photographs can't capture the subtle shifts in value, color, and temperature, especially cell phone photos, which tend to increase the contrast, deepen the shadows, and shift to a cooler temperature. These ivory tulips had a beautiful ivory green hue, but the original photo had shifted more towards white with blue shadows, so I adjusted it in Photoshop, making adjustments to the overall temperature, where I brought the shadows up some and the lighter areas down because they were a bit overexposed. One of the reasons I encourage you to work from life as much as possible is because it will be easier for you to see the subtle color shift in the light and the shadows on each petal. Because I work on a somewhat evenly toned neutral background, I like to push color a little bit more than I would if I was painting a fully realized background. This extra little pop of color helps my florals to stand out better against this neutral color. If you'll be painting any sort of background, I'd suggest blocking that in first. This will help you gauge both your values and your color better. You might not want to push color as much as I do, depending on what surrounds the flower you're painting, as those surrounding colors will also affect how the colors in your flower would be perceived. Even though my work can be considered realism, I've developed a process of working as simply as possible to achieve believable results. As I work, I'm constantly reminding myself I like my work to look like a painting, not like a photo, but really this is just my personal preference. There is no right or wrong. If you're a photorealistic painter, then 100% please go for it, paint like that. But for me, with my work, especially since I'm painting from life and some of my compositions can get pretty complex, I need to be very efficient and work very quickly. And the way that I found that that works for me is to paint a lot simpler, to work in an area very, very quickly, and then just move on. So I like to create this sense of a very painterly look up close. You can see the brush strokes, you can see the separation of all the colors, but then when you step back, it's like, wow, that looks kind of real, like that's kind of cool. So that's just my preference, that's just how I work. There is no right or wrong. You really have to paint the way that feels good for you and feels right for you, and really don't worry about what anybody else does, because that doesn't matter. Your style is really your signature. You know, what you do when you create a painting can only be done by you. And a lot of times I think artists get caught up in this whole idea that they like a specific artist and they love the way that they paint and they try and emulate that, but never really feels authentic. So it took me a long time to get to that point, to get to where I am in my work, because I really wanted to be a photorealistic painter. But over time, especially when I really started to hone in on what I wanted to say with my paintings and what my paintings were about and how I wanted to create them, it all kind of started to come together, and my style really emerged very quickly because I had to find a way within my process to create these paintings from life, but very, very quickly, because the flowers that I work with change very fast. And that's where I ended up in this kind of a streamlined process for painting realism. So I narrowed down my values. I only create 3 to 5 values for each color string that I mix up, and I like to simplify how I apply the paint. I'm working almost in a posterized way where I'm laying down blocks of color and then I'm very simply merging them together, but not really blending them. So that came about naturally for me. It wasn't something that I forced or something that I, kind of created out of nowhere. It just kind of happened. And if you haven't gotten there yet and you're looking at what I do and you think, oh my gosh, I really like that, don't let it affect you too much. Just really spend time painting however you want to paint. And the more you do it, the more it will become second nature, and your process and your style is going to emerge naturally on its own as you go. And speaking of process, you just saw that I drew onto the panel with a charcoal pencil. I transfer my drawings directly to my panel with charcoal, and then if I ever need to, I'll just kind of redraw things in, and then I use my kneaded eraser to kind of tap that charcoal and pull the excess off, so there's just a light line there. That way it doesn't mix into my paint. I find that that works a lot easier. It allows me flexibility, that if I decide as I'm going I don't like something or it would change faster than I could paint it, I can redraw it and easily erase off, not rub, but use the kneaded eraser to kind of tap off the charcoal drawing that was originally on there. It allows me a lot of flexibility that way, whereas if I would have used like graphite pencil or even paint to sketch my drawing on, that would have been a lot harder to remove, and I don't have a lot of flexibility with my backgrounds to make a lot of mistakes. So I find that charcoal is a easier way to edit my drawings as I go. As I work on this second tulip, you can see that it's shielded from the light source by the larger tulip that's on the left. Not necessarily in shadow, but it doesn't have that direct source of light shining on it. So it is a little bit darker. And one of the things that I see that people struggle with the most in painting light colored flowers is that they tend to mix their shadows a lot darker than what they really are. One common mistake I see when painting white or ivory flowers is when shadows are painted much darker than what they should be. This happens a lot when painting from photos because cameras tend to darken the shadows as the light meter tries to compensate for the bright white of the petals. It's always a good idea to edit photo reference and bring the shadows up some and the lights down to closer emulate how they would appear in reality, especially when you are using a more natural or ambient light source such as a window or diffuse lighting. This will create a softer, more gradual transition in values. My personal preference when painting white or ivory flowers is to use a natural light source because I've always enjoyed painting in a higher key, but that's just me. If you struggle with painting accurate values, I highly recommend using a value scale to key your values prior to painting. I go over this in my guide to painting white flowers, which is the first video in this 4-part series that I highly recommend checking out, and I've linked all of the videos in the description below. Another common mistake is not varying the temperature, such as painting the entire flower in either warm or cool colors. If you have a warm light source, your shadows will fall into a cooler temperature and vice versa. This can also happen when working from photos, and where working from life can give you the experience to know when you're working from a photographic reference that the camera is going to lose a lot of those temperature shifts. You can correct some of that with photo editing. but having that working knowledge will allow you to make decisions that will elevate your painting above your photographic reference. As I move on to the leaves and stems, this is where my painting anxiety relaxes and the process speeds up. I really do stress a lot when I'm painting flowers, especially when I'm working from life. There's a lot of decisions that need made and need made quickly. It can be really stressful when your subject is constantly moving and changing, but that's where I trust in my process and just keep charging forward. As I move through the leaves and stems, you can really see how I block in little areas of color, creating a somewhat posterized look at first. This helps me to see if I have all my value, temperatures, and even chroma correct before I merge each area together. If something doesn't look right, I have a handy wipe-off tool that wipes the paint right off the panel and I can repaint that area. I should note though that between each brush stroke, I'm wiping the brush clean, dipping it into my medium, and then wiping it clean again before I pick up the next brush full of paint. This helps to keep my colors from intermixing, although if I am working back and forth between lighter and darker colors, I'll sometimes use a brush for each, but overall, I'm really quite lazy when it comes to swapping out brushes. I tend to paint with only a few at a time, and I have no shame in admitting that. I know there are a lot of artists that use a ton of brushes in each painting session to keep all of their mixtures separate, but I am not that artist. My subjects change much too fast for me to be fussing with so many brushes in one session, so I just pick up what I'm going to work with and I stick with that my entire session. As this painting comes to completion, I want to point out the hierarchy of how I work through a painting. My first priority is to paint any of the buds first because they can go from closed to open incredibly fast. Then I'll move on to working on any open flowers. And as I mentioned, I save the leaves and the stems for last. Typically I work them from left to right across my panel, and the reason is pretty simple. I will, without a doubt, put my hand, arm, sleeve, or something into the wet paint. So to save myself the frustration, when I get to the leaves and stems, I always work left to right. And one last thing, if you look at the leaf on the lower back right side of the painting, I made a change to how that leaf fell. This was a compositional decision to better balance the painting. I don't always paint what's exactly in front of me if it doesn't lend to the composition. So I'll frequently edit out leaves that just don't work, or I'll add or change the location of leaves to suit the composition better, which comes back to my priority that above all else, I am creating a painting. So if something isn't working for me or something just doesn't fit the composition of the painting, I will edit it out, or sometimes I'll even create my own arrangement of leaves based on an idea of how I want the viewer to move through the painting. And here's the final painting. Thank you so much for watching this demo, and be sure to check the description for the other links in this series, especially the first video, which is like a little mini boot camp on how to paint white flowers.